Mr. Dix, private power. The NDP started that when they were in power. It's turned out a little differently. What are you going to do with the private power situation if you become government?
Well, it's a pretty serious situation. I mean, in many cases, contracts have been signed that are not very positive for British Columbia. The government, as you know, excluded many of these contracts from the BCUC. So we have to obviously review all those contracts. But for starters, we should get BC Hydro back in the business of producing energy. So it's public power, not private power.
Do you put an end to new ones, new licenses?
I think so. We'd certainly put a moratorium on it and take a look at it. We'd have to review what we had. And since it hadn't gone through BCUC review, I think we'd have to take a look at what we're inheriting. You know, in a lot of areas, and we don't know even now what we're going to inherit in 2013, what contracts will be signed between now and then.
But what do you need to know about the actual working of it? There's no question about it. It destroys the environment where they put their dams in, and there's no doubt about it that they're hugely expensive, double what BC Hydro can sell it for, probably 10 times more than the stuff they can make themselves. So why the hesitation?
So there's no hesitation. We just have to see what's in the contracts to see what we can do about it. And as you know, a lot of these stuff have been kept from the public. I mean, we don't have access to the information we need now. So I don't hesitate to say that we have a different approach, that we're going to be favoring and ensuring that BC Hydro gets back in the business, that we're going to be putting a moratorium on and reviewing those contracts. But you know, the question would be, what are the conditions by which a rotten contract could be broken? And you have to see the contract to know what that is.
You know, in talking to your predecessor a few years ago, I put to her this: if you ran for elections as mayor of a city, in a corrupt city, and you promised to clean it up, and you got in, you wouldn't still have your former mayor's brother-in-law running the cement business or running the city's business. Here you're going to find contracts, whether they're legal or not, are outrageously unfair to the people of British Columbia. Why don't you just cancel them? Buy them out if necessary.
Well, you'd have to look at that, but remember, buying them out will have costs. And so you have to act in the public interest, and that's what I would do. I'd have to act in the public interest. And so you have to deal with that as it is. And that means sometimes not being ideological, but being practical. But there's no hesitation in saying where our direction will be. I think John Horgan, our critic, has been pretty strong on these questions. He's laid it out pretty well. What we think that, in fact, this has had huge cost, and that every ratepayer in BC is now going to be paying the cost for years to come of a set of bad deals. But you have to be practical. We have to be practical.
Dealing with the people that are still in the, for want of a better expression, application stage. They haven't actually turned any dirt yet. You said you know how you stand on that. Well, if you know how you stand on it, why don't you tell me right now? You're just going to stop them. That's it.
Well, I think our approach, which is moratorium on new development and a review and relaunching BC Hydro, that's the right approach, and that's the approach we're going to take.
BC Hydro is broke. It's bust. In private sector terms, it's bust.
And this is, you know, one of the extraordinary things. I mean, it's a massive, I think, scandal. And we've seen it down all of the aspects of BC Hydro. They spent $1 billion on smart meters, right? If you're going to spend $1 billion on conservation,
that's a tax. That's smart meters, a tax.
Effectively, though, what you're doing is paying that cost to find out how much energy people are using. Why not, if you were going to do that, spend $1 billion on actually conserving energy, which compared to some of these projects would actually be a good investment and rate of return. So I think that BC Hydro has been badly led. By the Liberal government. They have used it as a cash cow for some of their friends at times. And so we would have a different approach. And what you've said is true. It's not going to be easy. But what we need now is transparency. People have to see these contracts. People have to see what's gone on. And then we've got to decide together what to do about it.
All right. What about Site C?
What about Site C? It should go, like everything else, to environmental assessment. Right?
Well, wait a minute. Let me stop you there, Mr. Dix, because
that's where they're going now.
I have been to enough environmental assessments that if I never went to one again, it would be too soon. As I've said before, I'd rather have a root canal done without anesthetic than go back into one of those rooms as somebody who wants to find out if there is merit in the deal.
But Rafe, here, let me tell you this. There's a study by a guy named Mark Haddock. He did a study of the environmental assessments in federal and provincial jurisdiction around the Prosperity Mine project, right? And what did it show? It showed that the provincial process didn't take into account any of the evidence, really, or much of the evidence, that the federal process came in, right? First thing that Christy Clark did when she became premier, was call up Stephen Harper and say you should overturn the federal environmental assessment decision on the Prosperity Mine. Now you got to be pretty far to the right to be to the right of Stephen Harper on the environment, but that's where she placed herself. So what I'm saying is we got to fix environmental assessment, because it's not going to be one project, it's going to be many projects, and we've got to give back to that environmental assessment
will you make just this one commitment?
Yes.
That when you set up new environmental assessments, the merits of the actual undertaking will be part of the process, not just what environmental things you'd like to have done. That I would be able to go to one of those things and say, look, this is wrong, it's not going to produce enough, blah, 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 blah. I could go and talk about it in principle instead of being shut up all the time, which I don't like very much.
Yes.
Yes, all right. Now, Site C, as I read it, it's to create power largely for fracking or for the tar sands, and using water from Williston Lake, which is supposed to be being turned into electricity. So in effect, what you're really doing is you're stopping one and then going on and getting a more expensive byproduct out of what you've done.
So you'll have to repeat that question. I didn't quite understand it.
I don't probably understand it myself, really, but Site C,
yes,
one of its purposes is going to be to provide power for the fracking process that is going on now. One of its purposes is going to be to help the tar sands. If those aren't the customers, then who the hell is?
Well, for Site C,
yeah.
I mean, if they were to do it, the customers would be both people in BC and presumably for export. That would be the process. I don't think it's primarily, I don't think the link for Site C is a link between Site C and fracking or Site C and the tar sands in that case. But I think what you have to do on Site C, the problem with Site C right now, and this is the challenge, is that set aside the environmental assessment process, because we should have a thorough process. Set that aside for the moment. I mean, we've bought all this expensive power, right? We're contracted for all this expensive power. So, and to some degree, what the government has done is bought the most expensive power they could possibly find. And they've taken away the market for more reasonable, more rational proposals.
All right, that takes me back to a question I should probably have asked you in the first place. Many people I talk to say that we don't need any power for the far distant future if we do a modicum of conservation, if we upgrade what we have, if we put facilities on dams that are now for flood storage only, and we pick up the power we send to the United States under the Columbia River Treaty, we don't need anything, much less Site C or private power.
Well, it's one of the absurd things. You know, we've gone through a whole amount of private development was launched on the liberal idea of self-sufficiency, right? Where they excluded from consideration as power that we own. Like, we can get the downstream benefits power at Blaine, right? Which makes it very valuable power. We're not getting it in the Peace, we're not getting it somewhere else, we're getting it at Blaine, which is very valuable for us because that's where our demand is, right? And so if we needed that power, surely we should count that as part of our assessment of our power resources. And yet they deliberately excluded the downstream benefits. They excluded other things, other power generation from consideration of what self-sufficiency, and then used the self-sufficiency argument to buy very expensive power. And that's why, in part, why we're in the mess we're in. So I think we have to assess where we're at.
You reverse that process by stopping all IPPs and stopping Site C.
Well, I don't know if you reverse that. I mean, my own view is you got to look at.
You're the leader. Your view is very important.
My view is very important. Yeah. My view is that we don't even know what contracts they'll sign between now and 2013. We know that they have, I think it's fair to say, hurt the public interest over the last number of years. They've excluded what they've done from regulatory review. And so obviously we're going to take things in a different direction. And first of all, by having BC Hydro be the leader in maximizing its power resources, as you suggest, by ensuring that we have the investment in conservation we need, because that makes sense. It makes a heck of a lot more sense to allow people to save power than it does for them to buy smart
I'll tell you
meters.
what really doesn't make sense. BC Hydro for years and years made a handsome dividend to the government every year. What I think in your years almost to $1 billion at one time, but certainly in the hundreds of millions. BC Hydro can't pay that anymore, but they're going to pay it because they're going to raise our rates so that they have the money, our money going back into the government.
Well, I mean, that all should be transparent, you know. Here's one of the great things that happened, and let's give historic credit, to the various governments at different times, and it was primarily the W.A.C. Bennett government, And prior to that, it had been Mr. Strachan had argued for the nationalization of BC Electric as leader of the NDP. And then the Social Credit Party
said no, and
Bennett said no, and it went after him and ridiculed him. Then he did it,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And so, but those leaders at that time, Mr. Strachan and Mr. Bennett at the time, made decisions that benefited us all. And what it meant for many, many years was that we had both low-cost power that assisted economic development in BC, and we got dividends that could help pay for healthcare and education. We own it, so we can use the dividends. And they have thrown that away. And so this is going to be a problem for governments from now on.
But they're
to
still
pay the cost of the Liberal government.
They're still going to get their dividends by forcing BC Hydro to raise rates to give them the dividend.
You got to be transparent about those things. Right. And I don't think there's anything wrong in principle with saying that if BC Hydro makes money, that they should use some of that money for healthcare and education.
Absolutely.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No,
but what's happened is, as you say, is that unfortunately a well-managed corporation has become a poorly managed corporation, and now it's the reverse of that, right? It used to be that healthcare and education benefited from BC Hydro. Now we're going to have to take from healthcare and education to pay off, in some cases, ridiculous contracts that have been signed.